Hello again, it's Andy here doing a video on some of my records. Now, to start off, a question. What's the best decade for music? And it's debated all the time. And generally speaking, I think the answer for most people is when your teens were, or typically when you were 16. Now, for me, that would be the 70s traditionally, because I would turn 13 in 1970. So I had all my teen years in the 70s and early 20s for that matter, and turned 16 in 1973, so 50 years ago, and it was a great year. But I'm not going to go on about the 1970s because it's been done lots of times before, hasn't it? And there's another 10-year period which for me is almost a match for it. Now maybe there aren't quite the heights of some of those early 70s stuff if you were into that, but there are some absolutely mega albums, and it's a period of time, a 10-year period, which was also pretty seismic in my personal life as well, in terms of just unprecedented change. So and it doesn't fit an exact decade, but it straddles an important date. So I'm calling this little series the Millennium years. So I'm talking about a period which leads up to the Millennium and then a little bit afterwards. So I'm going to go 1994 to 2003. So 10 absolutely mega years in terms of music, seismic in, stuff happening in the world. It was a millennium. And also in my life. So it's quite important. And I've got some great records here. Now, from a vinyl perspective, we're talking about the 90s mostly here. So, the vast majority of these are CDs. Pretty well all the ones I bought right up until the very end of this lot were on CD. But a few of them I've rebought or reissues on vinyl since. And there's a few in 1994, which is where I'm going to start with this. I'm planning on doing 10 of these, one for each year, not, occasional ones. I'm not quite sure how many albums I'm going to cover in each one. Probably not more than 10, hopefully not less than 5, but, maybe depending on what I've got when I actually come to look at it, I'll go through. But 1994 is mega. And I've picked 10 albums here. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the first 5, just whiz through them a little bit. And I confess I've probably got some controversial choices here, and that a lot of people would say, well, behind me, that's a lot better than that. So let's kick off. I'll try and run through these as quick as possible, but I think there's some interesting ones in here as well. So start off at number 10, and this is a CD. In fact, the first 5 are CDs, and the last 5 are vinyl ones. And I'm talking about Massive Attack's second album, Protection. Now it's slightly languishing in number 10 because I don't think it's their best album, but it's still a very good album. I mean, the opening couple of tracks, Protection and Karma Coma, are played a lot still. It's a good album. A controversial point is this album in the next year, and we'll see what I do for 95, was reissued as a remix by was it the Mad Professor? I can't remember. Anyway, called No Protection. It was another verse, and I actually prefer that to this one. So a good album, but only makes my number 10. Another could be controversial choice for my number 9 is the Holy Bible, Manic Street Preachers. Now when I sort of worked out my list of what I'd got for 1994, I expected this to be a bit higher, but having listened to it with some of the others, I think I've got to confess to being slightly bored with the Manics. I mean, I like it, but it's not really sort of setting me alight. It's a nice one, and it's not my favourite album of theirs, even though it's the last one with Richie Edwards in it. So controversial maybe, but good album. But I'm going to use the word seminal because a lot of the stuff I've got here, I would say is seminal. Not all of them, but there's some great debuts. There's some truly seminal albums, and there's at least one album which I think is seminal, but most people won't have ever heard of it. Anyway, this one is a great debut. I don't think it's seminal. It's good. It's decent. And we're talking about Oasis's debut, Definitely Maybe. And there's some great songs on here. You know, we're talking 94 coming into the Britpop era, which I don't like the term of. It's sort of a bit meaningless, other than they were British bands who were popular at the time. And as ever with any of that, there was some crap in there and there was some good stuff. And, you know, this is very good. But actually, when I've re-listened to some of these, it's not quite as good. And the next one, possibly a controversial choice, but I prefer this to the other ones. And I'm talking about Underworld's magnificently titled Dub No Bass With My Head Man, all in one word, which is very possibly one of my favourite album names ever. And it's not necessarily one of Underworld's best, but it's great. And when I listen to it again with all the others, this has really stood the test of time, and particularly listening to it back to back with the Holy Bible. You know, I did enjoy this a lot more. It's a great album. Where are we? What's the Cowgirl? I think is probably the standout track on that, certainly the most famous. And coming now to probably what is the first seminal, or what might be considered seminal album, and it's the last of my, and it's Blur's Part Life. You know, well, what can you say? Everybody knows it. I mean, if you like Blur, you're going to like it. If you hate Blur, you're not going to like it. But it's got some great tracks on here. Tracy Jacks, End of a Century, Girls and Boys, the title track, Part Life. You know, it's a great album. I really like it, but I like the next five more. So I sort of said, setting the scene a little bit, I wanted to start in music, but this period is also pretty seminal for me, and there was a fairly massive change which started even more change over the next 10 years in 94. So when we started the year, I was working in Manchester, living in Macclesfield, and I'd been there for, I don't know, about 6 or 7 years at that stage. And during the year, I got promoted to with the company I worked for at the time, to be their national sales and marketing manager, which entailed a move back to Birmingham. So during the year, massive change, big promotion, difficult job, lots of pressure, lots of learning, and encompassed with some great music. And I ended up the year living in Sutton Coldfield near Birmingham. So that's my first big change. And let's get on to the top five. And somewhat amazingly, I've got all of these on vinyl. Obviously, they are all reissues. You know, I haven't got any original stuff. There weren't, you know, you don't tend to find original early 90s. The next one, is one which I've promoted. When I said I've listened to some of them back to back, this has gone right up the tube. And at the end, up the list, because at the end of the day, I actually like this better than the other ones. And maybe that's because ultimately I'm a bit of a 70s prog head. And I'm talking about Marillion's album, Brave. And this particular example is the Stephen Wilson remix stroke remaster, which was issued in 2018. I think it wasn't that long ago anyway. And funnily enough, it's not one, you know, I was into at the time. I sort of, you know, I thought Marillion had gone when Fish left, to be honest, in the late 80s. But I'm not sure whether this is the first album. It's certainly an early album with Fish's replacement, the singer, Steve Hogarth. But it is excellent. And in listening to it again, it is a really, really good album. So I think that merits, you know, in my number five. So we're now coming to seminal. This one is a genuinely seminal album, and somebody with the most beautiful voice, and I'm talking about Jeff Buckley's Grace. Silly boy, left us far too early. I don't know, but what can you say? I mean, Lilac Wine, Mojo Pin, Grace, possibly the best cover of Hallelujah. Though actually, I think J.D. Lang's version pushes him quite close, and obviously the original. But a great album, one I got a few years ago on vinyl. I think of all places, I bought it in the supermarket in Sainsbury's. I think I was going past, but anyway, I bought this. I don't know, 6-7 years ago on vinyl. I had it on CD since the mid-90s. Now, the next one to me is truly seminal, but I doubt anyone will have heard of it or think of it as that. And the album is by a band called Bark Psychosis, and it's called Hex. It's a double album. I won't go through the tracks because they're not individually standout tracks. It's the album which is amazing to me. And the reason it's seminal is because it was this album which the term post-rock was coined for. So it was coined by a journalist writing a review of this album, and he referred to the band as or tried to describe them in a way, and coined the term post-rock, which, as people who know me know I'm well into. So it came out in 1994, and it merits my number 3. So we're coming to the top 2 now. And the first one, the first of my top 2, so number 2, is The Division Bell by Pink Floyd. I've always been into Pink Floyd, but I sort of, when it started going all a bit tits up with Waters and battling and so on and arguing the toss and going his own way, essentially, I sort of lost slight interest. So I wasn't, The Wall left me a bit sort of, it was The Wall. There were some amazing tracks in there, some amazing bits. But as a whole album, I wasn't terribly into it. Similarly, as the 80s went on, I was sort of losing interest in music at the time. Stuff passed me by a little bit. But when I heard this in 94, to me, this was almost like a natural successor to Animals. So it felt to me as though it was almost a move on from that sort of mid-70s classic Floyd era, and is an amazing album. And obviously I got it at the time on CD and have bought it in recent years as a vinyl album. I can't remember when, it's in the last 3 or 4 years anyway. So, what do I want to say? You got What Do You Want From Me, Great Day from Freedom, Poles Apart. It's a real, all killer, no filler, and absolute Floyd at their best. And obviously they have done bits since then, but this really was a sort of almost a going out peak. So it leads me to my number 1, and this is another truly seminal album, truly a all killer, no filler, and I think in a lot of ways, this was one of the albums which was really instrumental for getting me strongly back into music after sort of dipping out for the 80s. So I started to listen to stuff again in the early 90s, but it was a bit more sporadic. But I think by the time 94 came along, and particularly this album, it really wowed me. And I play it to death today. It's absolutely amazing. And I am talking about Portishead's Dummy, and if you, great album, all the tracks listed on there, and as you can see, they're all absolute classics from Mr. On's, Sour Times, Strangers. It could be Sweet, Wandering Star, Numb, Roads, Pedestal, Biscuit, and Glory Box. Every single one of them is an absolute classic. And it really showed to me how, a modern band can mix traditional instruments, quite bluesy traditional instruments with DJ scratching and samples, and the absolutely aching vocals of Beth Gibbon. Superb album. The follow-up, the eponymous one, which came a year or two later, is also good, I think. But and in fact, some people prefer it. But this, to me, is the classic. So there's my number one for 1994, and it would appear in the decade I'm talking about, or the 10 years I'm talking about, would appear somewhere in the top 10 for the whole decade. I've absolutely no doubt. I haven't actually thought of that. So there we go. That's the first of these occasional videos I'm going to do of each year of the period of what I'm calling the Millennium year, shall we say. So the period leading up to the Millennium from 1994 and then going over into 2003, which, as I say, is awash with some fabulous albums, which are up there with, the greats of the 70s, in my opinion. I'll leave the 80s aside because it wasn't my period. And it was also pretty immense from a personal point of view, and I'll sort of mention that as we go through, because there were some huge moves around and lots of stuff going on. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.